My boyfriend's mother tried to remove me, but she lost her son instead. I had been with Ethan for almost 2 years when I finally met his mother Linda. We moved slowly because he warned me she was harsh with anyone he dated, but I believed patience and kindness would smooth things out. I worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center downtown, lived alone in my own apartment, and my parents ran a small neighborhood bakery they had built from nothing. Ethan was finishing his medical residency, exhausted but hopeful, and we had started talking seriously about building a life together. So meeting his mother felt like a natural step rather than a threat. The first meeting happened at a restaurant. Ethan chose carefully because it was one of her favorites. She arrived late and scanned me from head to toe before saying anything kind, then casually asked Ethan why he never mentioned I was ethnic. I am Italian, but she said it like an accusation. Dinner turned into an interrogation, where she questioned whether physical therapy was a real career for someone dating a future doctor, asked if my parents were citizens even though they were born in Philadelphia, and implied I must be interested in Ethan for financial reasons even though I earned more than he did during residency. Ethan tried to redirect the conversation again and again, but she spoke over him as if neither of us mattered. After that night, nothing improved. Linda called Ethan whenever we were together and talked loudly about other women she thought he should meet, women from her country club with the right backgrounds. When he told her he was with me, she dismissed it as temporary. She showed up unannounced at his apartment and acted shocked that I was still around. She brought up his ex Laura repeatedly and mentioned that Laura's father was a judge who could help Ethan's career. Ethan told her to stop. She laughed and said she was only making conversation. Every interaction felt like a small cut meant to wear me down. Slowly, on Ethan's birthday, she hosted a party and gave me the wrong address. When Ethan called worried after hours passed, I rushed there, and Linda loudly announced to the room that I could not even show up on time for important events. Ethan corrected her in front of everyone, and she smiled sweetly and said mistakes happen. After that, she started calling me by every name except my own, correcting herself with false apologies while remembering the names of every nurse and barista she ever met. Ethan corrected her every time, and she claimed she was terrible with names. The breaking point came when Ethan was on call at the hospital and Linda appeared at my apartment. She said we needed a woman-to-woman talk, then calmly explained that Ethan would never marry someone like me because I did not fit their social world. She said my parents were nice people but shopkeepers, and that kind of connection would not help Ethan succeed. Then she accused my family of pushing me to date above my place and suggested I trapped a doctor. She smiled while saying Ethan would eventually come to his senses. Something inside me finally snapped. I told her she was right about one thing. Ethan deserved better than a lifetime of managing his mother's jealousy and control. I said any woman who married him would inherit decades of manipulation, and I was not interested in living that way. I told her she had won and I was done. She smiled like this was the outcome she expected and said she knew I would see reason. An hour later, Ethan called from the hospital after receiving messages from his mother claiming I came to her house and said horrible things before dumping him. I told him the truth, and he drove straight to my apartment, still in his scrubs. Ethan cried and begged me not to let her win, but I was exhausted down to my bones. I told him I loved him but could not spend my life fighting his mother for basic respect. We ended our relationship that night. The next day, Linda called him to check on him and suggested he reconnect with Laura. Something in Ethan shut down completely after that. He stopped answering his mother's calls, picked up extra shifts, and slept at the hospital even when he was not scheduled. Colleagues later told me he lost significant weight in the first month. Ethan's father Robert tried to bring him to family dinners, but Ethan refused if Linda would be there. She insisted he was being dramatic and would recover soon. Months passed and Ethan took medical leave after making a mistake during a procedure caused by exhaustion. No patient was harmed, but it terrified him. His attending physician told his parents Ethan showed signs of severe depression. Around that time I met Mark at my cousin's wedding. He was a firefighter with an easy laugh and a warm family who welcomed me immediately. Linda somehow learned about him through mutual friends. 6 months after the breakup, Linda began showing up at my workplace, first watching from her car, then sitting in the waiting room, and finally approaching me in tears begging me to take Ethan back. My co-workers stared as the woman who spent months humiliating me now pleaded to save her son. She looked smaller than I remembered, hollow, like something essential had cracked. I refused to talk inside and walked toward the parking lot. She followed, telling me Ethan barely ate and lived at the hospital. Her voice broke on his name and my chest tightened despite myself. I told her she got what she wanted and needed to leave me alone. She stepped closer and blocked my car, grabbed my arm and said Ethan made another medication error recently, one that almost hurt a patient. The hospital was discussing ending his residency entirely. Her makeup streaked down her face and part of me felt a terrible satisfaction seeing her so broken, which made me ashamed of myself. I pulled away, locked myself in my car, and drove home shaking, torn between caring about Ethan and resenting Linda for trying to use me again. Mark was cooking when I arrived, and I collapsed into tears without explanation. He turned off the stove and held me while I told him everything. He listened quietly and asked what I wanted to do. I said I did not know because months earlier, I loved Ethan enough to imagine marrying him. That night I could not sleep and checked Ethan's social media for the first time since the breakup. His last post showed a tired, hollow version of the man I loved. I closed the app and stared at the ceiling until morning the next day. Linda called repeatedly until I blocked her. Then she called my workplace until my supervisor intervened and asked if I needed help with a stalking situation. Embarrassed and overwhelmed, I agreed to meet Linda at a coffee shop just to make it stop. She showed me photos of Ethan looking thin and unwell and admitted she underestimated how deeply he loved me. She said she believed he would recover like he did after past relationships, but this time he collapsed inward. She told me therapists said she caused it by interfering and that she finally understood she destroyed his happiness. Asked why she thought I would help after everything she did. She said she did not deserve my help but Ethan did, and she would stay out of our lives completely if I returned. I stood up to leave and she cried again, begging me to think about it. I walked out without looking back, sitting in my car shaking as the afternoon sun burned my eyes. Traffic crawled as I replayed her words, the photos, the tears that might finally be real. I pulled into a gas station and called my friend Sarah, the one person who knew the whole story. Sarah listened quietly as I told her everything, then said I needed to be honest with myself. I realized I had been with Mark because his life was easy and peaceful, because his mother smiled at me and there was no war to fight, but easy was not the same as right. I drove home feeling hollow. That night Mark asked about my day and I told him the truth. He asked gently if I was thinking about Ethan, and I said yes. He thanked me for being honest and held my hand without demanding answers. The next morning at work I could not focus and my supervisor suggested I take time off. Instead I texted Alex, Ethan's friend from the hospital, asking to meet for coffee. When we sat down, he told me Ethan was barely functioning, working double shifts, sleeping at the hospital, eating only when forced, attending therapy but not engaging. Alex said nothing had helped and that I might be the only person who could reach him. He was not asking me to fix Ethan, only to consider talking to him once. I left feeling like a weight had settled on my chest. A week passed after my conversation with Alex and I could not shake the image of Ethan barely holding himself together. Mark noticed my distraction during dinners and movies and even quiet mornings. Finally, he asked directly if I was thinking about Ethan again and I told him yes because lying felt worse. I explained what Alex told me and how guilty I felt even though I knew logically I was not responsible. Mark listened in silence and said he appreciated my honesty more than comfort built on pretending. His sadness was calm and steady and that somehow hurt more than anger ever could. That night sleep refused to come and sometime after midnight I reached for my phone without thinking. Ethan's number was still there, untouched like a door I never fully closed. My hands shook as I pressed call and waited through each ring, wondering if I would regret this forever. On the fifth ring he answered, sounding groggy and confused. I said his name and nothing else. Silence stretched so long I thought the call dropped. Then he said my name like a question filled with disbelief, like hearing a voice from a dream you never expect to hear again. We talked quietly for a while, and his voice sounded thin and hollow. He apologized for his mother and for not protecting our relationship when it mattered. He said he did not blame me for leaving and understood why I did, but admitted he could not figure out how to function without me and hated himself for feeling that way. I told him he needed real help and honesty in therapy instead of just showing up. He admitted he avoided talking about losing me because it made everything permanent. He said seeing photos of me with Mark felt like proof I moved on easily. While he fell apart when he asked if I was happy with Mark, the word yes caught in my throat and the silence answered for me. He said he did not want to disrupt my life again, but if there was any chance I still cared, he would do whatever it took, including standing up to his mother for real this time. I told him I needed time, and he said he would wait no matter how long. After we hung up, I sat in the dark crying because I realized I never stopped loving him. I only learned how to survive without him. Mark was still at practice when the call ended, and the apartment felt unbearably quiet. I wandered between rooms, drinking water and staring at nothing. When Mark finally came home, he saw my face and knew something changed. I told him about the call and Ethan's apology and broken voice. Mark listened and then said gently that he knew part of me had been somewhere else for a while. He said he cared deeply but would not be someone's second choice. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I told him he was the safe choice. The truth hurt us both and settled heavily between us. We sat with that honesty until Mark said we should take space, so I could sort out my feelings. Not a breakup, but a pause. I agreed because staying while my heart drifted elsewhere felt unfair. That night, I slept in the guest room and the distance between us felt enormous, despite thin walls. Within a week I moved back into my old apartment and Mark helped carry boxers in silence. The space felt different this time, not lonely, but heavy with choices. My friend Sarah came over that night with wine and asked what I planned to do. I said I did not know and meant it. Days later, Robert called and asked to meet for coffee. I nearly ignored the call, but curiosity won. He arrived early and apologized immediately for staying silent while Linda treated me badly. He said he thought neutrality would keep peace, but realized it only enabled her control. He explained Linda's obsession with status came from her childhood watching her parents struggle endlessly. Understanding the origin did not erase my anger but added complexity. Robert said he was in therapy now and told Linda she needed serious help if she wanted any relationship with Ethan. He said he would choose his son over comfort if forced. I asked why he told me all this, and he said, I deserved to know what I would be walking back into. Linda was trying but far from fixed and might never fully change. If I returned, I needed open eyes and firm boundaries. He admitted he feared they already destroyed Ethan's chance at happiness. His voice cracked when he said it, and I believed his regret was real. I left with more information but no clarity. My thoughts spun for days until I scheduled my own therapy appointment, sitting in that beige office admitting out loud that I wanted Ethan but feared repeating the same pain. The therapist helped me see that leaving marked stability. To even consider Ethan again revealed deeper feelings than I allowed myself to admit. She asked what would need to change for me to feel safe, and I listed boundaries and accountability. Leaving therapy, I felt unsettled but focused. That evening I called Alex again and asked honestly how Ethan was doing. He said something shifted after my call, and Ethan finally opened up in therapy and started going twice a week. There was no finish line, but there was effort, and that mattered. 2 days later, I texted Ethan asking if he wanted to meet for coffee, and he replied immediately. We met at a shop halfway between our apartments, and when he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner and exhausted, but when he saw me, something softened in his face. We talked for hours, and he took full responsibility without excuses. He explained how he grew up prioritizing peace over his own needs and how therapy Papia helped him understand the enmeshment with his mother. He said he was not asking me to return immediately, only to stay in contact while he proved real change. Over the following weeks we texted daily and met a few times. Slowly, I saw light return to him. He gained weight and spoke with more confidence. Then Linda called me asking to apologize in person, and my first instinct was suspicion. I called Ethan immediately, and he said his therapist thought it could help if done properly and with him present. I agreed reluctantly, and we met at a neutral restaurant. Linda apologized for specific actions and acknowledged seeing me as a threat instead of a person. Some of it felt rehearsed, but some felt painfully really noticed. She kept glancing at Ethan for approval and pointed it out. She became defensive, then stopped and admitted it was a habit she struggled to break. After she left, Ethan and I discussed what felt genuine and what still worried us. He admitted his mother might never fully change but promised to hold boundaries no matter how uncomfortable. Weeks later he asked directly if I was ready to try again officially. I told him I wanted to but needed clear agreements about his mother. We spent hours discussing rules and consequences and wrote them down together. When everything was laid out in writing, he looked me in the eye and said he would rather lose his mother than lose me again. And for the first time I believed him. We decided to date again slowly with weekly check-ins and continued therapy. The next step was telling Mark, and that conversation hurt deeply but felt honest. He wished me well and asked me not to return if things fell apart. I respected that boundary and let him go. As Ethan and I rebuilt carefully, I noticed changes in both of us. Stronger communication and willingness to face conflict instead of avoiding it. Months passed and Ethan made breakthroughs in therapy, confronting his fear of disappointing his mother. Linda tested boundaries with subtle comments and guilt, but Ethan shut it down every time and followed through with consequences. Robert's support remained firm. Eventually, Ethan was cleared to return fully to work, and his joy was evident. Our relationship stabilized into something more grounded than before. When Ethan asked me to join a family therapy session, my anxiety spiked, but I agreed. Watching Linda struggle to accept she could not control outcomes confirmed change would be slow and imperfect. After that session, Ethan admitted his fear that his mother might never truly change and that her issues could always shadow our lives. I told him what mattered was his commitment to boundaries, not her perfection. We sat with that truth knowing it would define our future. A week later, he asked again if I was ready to be together fully with clear rules and shared accountability. I said yes cautiously, and we wrote everything down again. When we signed those pages, it felt strange and hopeful at the same time, like choosing intention over fear. When Ethan and I decided to officially rebuild what we lost, we did it carefully and without grand gestures. We agreed on weekly dinners and daily messages that checked in on feelings rather than plans. Everything felt slower but steadier, like learning to walk again after a long injury. I noticed Ethan interrupting patterns he once defaulted to, speaking his mind instead of swallowing discomfort, and I found myself doing the same. No longer smoothing over tension just to keep peace. Linda tested those boundaries sooner than I expected. She called Ethan multiple times in one afternoon when he did not answer immediately, leaving voicemails filled with concern that sounded caring on the surface but carried a familiar edge underneath. Comments about how I must be keeping him busy or how worried she was about his priorities. Ethan listened once and then sent a message stating the comments were inappropriate, and he would call her back the following week. When she tried again, he followed through and did not answer. The consistency mattered more than the words. Robert called me separately to apologize for Linda's behavior and assured me he supported every boundary Ethan enforced. even when Linda complained that she was being punished unfairly. Hearing that steadiness from him eased something in my chest that had been tight for months. It was the first time I felt like I was not standing alone against a family dynamic far bigger than me. Ethan told me later that holding those boundaries felt terrifying but also freeing. Like choosing oxygen over silence at work, I noticed my focus returning. Patients commented that I seemed lighter, and my supervisor smiled knowingly without asking questions. Outside the hospital, Ethan began reclaiming pieces of himself he had set aside. He returned to the gym, picked up his guitar again, and started cooking instead of living off cafeteria food. Each small change felt like a quiet victory, not dramatic or loud, but deeply meaningful. I watched him reassemble his life with intention instead of avoidance. 5 months after returning to limited duties, Ethan was called into a meeting with his attending physician. He went in nervous and emerged relieved, cleared for full responsibilities and praised for renewed focus and engagement. He came straight to my apartment that evening, nearly bouncing with excitement, saying it was the first time in a year he felt like himself at work, not hiding or surviving but actually caring again. We celebrated with takeout and laughter that felt earned rather than forced. Robert took me aside during a supervised family dinner and thanked me for giving Ethan another chance. He said watching his son come back to life had been humbling and joyful at the same time. He promised again that he would not allow Linda to threaten our relationship, even if it meant discomfort at home. I believed him because his actions matched his words, and that consistency built trust where none existed before. Over the next months, Linda continued therapy and showed gradual improvement. She asked about my day without backhanded comments and spoke about Ethan's work without framing it as a risk. She still slipped occasionally, and each time Ethan addressed it immediately, ending conversations when needed and following through with reduced contact. The predictability of consequences seemed to teach her what apologies alone never had. That access depended on respect. Ethan and I talked weekly about everything, not just Linda but work stress and future plans and fears that still lingered. Those conversations became the backbone of our relationship, a space where nothing was minimized or hidden. We learned how to disagree without withdrawing and how to reassure without over. The trust rebuilt slowly, but it was sturdier than what we had before. One evening Ethan suggested we look at apartments together. Not as a rush but as an exploration. We spent weekends walking through spaces that did not quite fit until we found a third-floor walk-up filled with light and a kitchen that invited use. Signing the lease felt surreal and grounding all at once. That night, Ethan called his parents to share the news. Robert congratulated us immediately. Linda paused, then said it was wonderful, and asked if we needed help. Ethan told her we had it covered and would reach out when settled. The next day, Ethan said he needed to set ground rules before we moved. We drove to his parents' house and sat together in their living room. Ethan explained that Linda would need to call before visiting and would not have a key. He said their home would be their space. Linda protested briefly, saying it felt extreme, but Robert stepped in and supported Ethan firmly. Linda agreed reluctantly, and the tension eased only after. Ethan held my hand and did not waver. Moving day came quietly and Linda arrived later with kitchen towels and a restrained smile. She stayed 30 minutes and left without snooping or commenting. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Our apartment slowly became home, filled with routines and shared mornings and evenings that felt peaceful rather than guarded. I avoided dealing with Mark's belongings for weeks. His sweatshirt still hung in my closet like a reminder of a different life. Eventually, I texted him to return his things and we met at a coffee shop. He looked healthier and introduced me to Sarah, the woman he was seeing. Relief washed over me as we spoke kindly and without bitterness. He wished me well, and I wished him happiness. Watching them leave together, I felt closure instead of regret. Ethan planned a weekend trip to a quiet cabin by a lake, saying he needed distance from hospitals and family dynamics. The drive felt like an exhale. We hiked and cooked together and talked about nothing urgent. That night under the stars, he pulled out a simple ring and told me he wanted a life where we chose each other first without interference. I said yes, because the promise felt supported by action, not hope. A year after our breakup, we began planning a small wedding. Linda struggled with her limited role and offered suggestions she had no authority over. Ethan shut each one down calmly and consistently. Robert supported him and redirected Linda back to therapy when needed. Dinners remained monthly and sometimes awkward but manageable. Our apartment filled with anticipation rather than dread. As we planned our future, I noticed how much we both had changed. Ethan no longer sought approval at the cost of himself, and I no longer tolerated disrespect for the sake of harmony. The life we were building was imperfect and required vigilance, but it was ours, grounded in honesty and boundaries rather than fear. And for the first time I felt confident that love, paired with effort, could withstand even the most difficult histories. Planning the wedding became a quiet test of everything Ethan and I had rebuilt. Every choice felt symbolic even when it should have been simple. The venue was small and filled with natural light, the guest list intentional rather than impressive, and the pace unhurried. Linda struggled most with not being at the center of it. She called frequently during the first weeks with suggestions disguised as excitement. Comments about menus and flowers and seating that felt harmless until you heard the need for control. Underneath each time, Ethan responded the same way. thanking her for caring and reminding her that decisions were ours. When she pushed, he ended the call and waited before answering again. Robert backed him consistently, and that mattered more than any apology ever could. Watching Ethan hold that line without wavering did something profound to my sense of safety. It showed me that boundaries were not theoretical anymore. They were practiced and enforced. Even when uncomfortable, we settled into a rhythm that balanced connection with independence. Weekly check-ins where we talked openly about stress and fears. Daily messages that were not constant but intentional. I noticed how often Ethan asked how I felt instead of assuming, and how often I spoke up when something bothered me rather than internalizing it. Conflict no longer felt like a threat but like information. Something we could use rather than avoid at work. My life felt steady again. Patients progressed and celebrated milestones. Colleagues commented on my focus and calm. The chaos that once followed me like a shadow had faded, not because life became easy, but because I felt anchored. Ethan experienced something similar at the hospital. He volunteered for cases again, mentored younger residents, and laughed more freely. The weight he carried for so long did not disappear overnight, but it loosened. Its grip. Linda continued therapy, and there were moments when I saw genuine effort. She asked about my family without judgment, and listened when I spoke. She still struggled when attention drifted away from her, but she corrected herself more often now, sometimes mid-sentence. Those moments gave me cautious hope, even as I remained alert. I learned that trust did not mean blind faith but consistent observation. As the wedding approached, Linda had setbacks. One evening she called Ethan, crying about how excluded she felt, and hinted that I was turning him against his family. Ethan listened calmly, then reminded her that emotional manipulation would not change boundaries. He ended the call and did not engage further. Later, he admitted it hurt to hear his mother in distress, but said it hurt more to imagine losing me again. His clarity steadied us both. Olbert called me afterward and apologized for the call, even though he was not responsible. He said Linda was struggling with grief over losing the version of her son she thought she owned. But that grief did not entitle her to control. Hearing that acknowledgement from him felt validating in a way I did not expect. It confirmed that this was not just Ethan fighting alone anymore. We decided to keep wedding interactions structured. Monthly dinners at restaurants with clear start and end times. No planning discussions unless invited. It reduced tension and prevented misunderstandings. Linda adapted slowly, and while resentment flickered beneath the surface, she complied. Structure became our ally, removing ambiguity where manipulation once thrived. As months passed, I reflected often on the version of myself who once tried to earn acceptance through patience and silence. I recognized how deeply I had equated endurance with love. Letting go of that belief was uncomfortable but liberating. I no longer measured my worth by how much discomfort I could absorb. Instead, I measured relationships by mutual respect and accountability. Ethan noticed these changes too, and said watching me assert myself gave him courage to do the same. We grew not just alongside each other but because of each other. Our growth intertwined rather than competing. The partnership felt balanced in a way I had not known before. We attended another family therapy session closer to the wedding date. The therapist focused on expectations and boundaries around the ceremony. Linda expressed sadness about not being involved in decisions, and the therapist validated her feelings without endorsing control. Ethan articulated clearly what involvement would look like and what it would not. Robert supported him openly. The dynamic felt different this time, less explosive and more grounded. Afterward, Ethan admitted the session drained him but also affirmed his progress. He said, hearing himself speak so firmly without shaking felt like proof of change. We went home and cooked dinner quietly, sharing space without needing to fill it with reassurance. That calm felt like a reward. Mark crossed my mind occasionally, but without longing. I hoped he was happy and trusted that ending things honestly spared us deeper pain later. Closure came not from forgetting but from understanding. I felt gratitude for what that chapter taught me about safety and honesty. Even as I committed fully to the life Ethan and I were building, the weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of small decisions and quiet moments. Fitting dresses and choosing music. Writing vows that reflected truth rather than fantasy. Ethan struggled with his vows at first, worried about promising things he could not guarantee. We talked about it and agreed to promise effort and honesty instead of perfection. That choice felt right. Linda attempted one last push, suggesting a change to the ceremony that would place her more prominently. Ethan declined and reminded her of previous agreements. She sighed heavily and said she was trying. Ethan thanked her and ended the conversation before it could spiral. Later, he admitted it saddened him that progress came with constant vigilance, but he said it was a price he was willing to pay for Pison. The morning of the wedding, I felt nervous but not fearful, surrounded by friends who knew the full story and supported us without reservation. When Ethan saw me, his eyes filled with emotion that felt grounded rather than desperate. We exchanged vows that acknowledged hardship and choice, commitment forged through effort rather than idealism. Linda attended quietly, dressed elegantly and restrained. She smiled and cried at appropriate moments. Robert sat beside her with a steady presence. There were no scenes and no surprises. Afterward, Linda hugged me briefly and said she hoped she could continue to earn trust. I thanked her without promising more than I could give. Married life did not transform everything overnight. It simply continued the work we had already begun. Boundaries remained necessary. Communication remained intentional. Love remained active rather than assumed. We returned to routines that felt familiar and new all at once. Looking back, I understood that the true turning point was not the apology or the therapy or even the proposal. It was the moment Ethan chose to protect our relationship consistently even when it cost him comfort, and the moment I chose not to accept less than respect. Together those choices reshaped not only our future but who we were becoming as we settled into marriage. I felt a quiet confidence replace the anxiety that once ruled me, the certainty that whatever challenges came next, we would face them openly and together. Not because everything was fixed but because we were committed to the work, and that commitment made all the difference. Marriage did not erase the past, but it softened its sharpest edges. Ethan and I learned quickly that building a life meant daily choices rather than grand declarations. Mornings began with shared coffee and quiet check-ins. Evenings ended with conversations that revisited boundaries and emotions before they could harden into resentment. The work was steady and sometimes tiring, but it felt purposeful. Like tending a structure we both valued enough to maintain, Linda remained a presence that required awareness. She called once a week and occasionally tested limits with subtle remarks framed as concern. Each time Ethan responded calmly and consistently, ending calls when necessary and following through with reduced contact. There were moments she seemed genuinely proud of his independence, and others where grief and control resurfaced. What mattered was that Ethan no longer absorbed her emotions as his responsibility. He acknowledged them without surrendering himself. Robert continued to support us openly. He checked in with Ethan privately and with me respectfully, never asking me to manage Linda or soften reality for her comfort. His consistency created a buffer that allowed limited family interactions to remain manageable. Monthly dinners stayed structured and predictable. Linda adapted to the format even when she disliked it. The lack of chaos was not accidental but cultivated. Our apartment evolved into a home filled with routines that felt earned. Shared grocery lists and Sunday walks and small arguments resolved without withdrawal. We talked openly about finances and future plans and fears that still surfaced from time to time. Honesty became our default rather than something summoned only during crises. I noticed how different this felt from my earlier years when silence masqueraded as peace. At work, I advanced into a leadership role at the rehabilitation center, mentoring younger therapists and building programs that reflected my values. The confidence I gained from my personal boundaries carried into professional spaces. Patients responded to my steadiness, and colleagues sought my input. It felt like reclaiming parts of myself I once dimmed to accommodate others. Ethan thrived in his medical career with renewed clarity. He no longer worked to escape his emotions but engaged fully with his patients and colleagues. Supervisors noticed his growth and invited him to contribute to teaching rounds. He spoke openly about mental health when appropriate and encouraged residents to seek help early. His vulnerability became a strength rather than a liability. There were moments when fear crept in unexpectedly, memories triggered by familiar tones or situations that echoed the past. When that happened, we named it without judgment, grounding ourselves in present reality rather than spiraling into old narratives. Therapy remained a constant for Ethan and occasionally for us together, a space to recalibrate and prevent drift. Linda experienced setbacks, particularly during holidays. Expectations clashed with established boundaries and emotions ran high. One year she hinted about hosting a large gathering that excluded my family. Ethan declined politely and reiterated our plans. She cried and accused him of abandoning tradition. He responded with empathy without reversing course. Afterward, he admitted the sadness lingered but said it no longer dictated his choices. My relationship with Linda remained cautious but civil. Trust rebuilt slowly through consistent behavior rather than apologies. There were moments of genuine connection when she asked about my work or my parents with sincere interest. I acknowledged those moments without letting them erase history. Acceptance did not require amnesia. I crossed paths with Mark once at a local event. He smiled warmly and introduced me to Sarah, who was now his partner. There was no tension, only mutual respect and quiet gratitude for lessons learned. We exchanged brief updates and wished each other well. Walking away, I felt peace rather than regret. Confirmation that honesty had spared us deeper wounds. As years passed, Ethan and I faced challenges unrelated to family, job stress and health scares and disagreements about timing and priorities. We navigated them with the same tools that carried us through the hardest season: communication and accountability and willingness to course correct. The foundation held because it was built intentionally. One evening while organizing old photos, I came across images from the early days of our relationship, smiles that hid unspoken tension and hope that relied more on endurance than clarity. I felt compassion for that version of myself who believed love meant tolerating discomfort. Growth did not erase her but honored her effort by choosing differently. Ethan noticed me lingering over the photos and joined me. He acknowledged his own evolution with humility, recognizing how fear once guided his decisions and how painful it was to confront that truth. We talked about the cost of change and the relief that followed, understanding that growth often demanded loss before offering peace. Linda eventually acknowledged in her own way that things would never return to how they were. She expressed sadness but also pride in Ethan's independence. Her therapy continued, and while perfection never arrived, progress did. She learned to pause before speaking and to ask rather than assume. It was imperfect but meaningful. Robert retired from work, and focused on hobbies and friendships that enriched his life beyond family roles. His contentment reduced pressure on Linda and allowed her to explore identity beyond motherhood. Watching their dynamic shift reinforced the truth that systems change when individuals do the work. Ethan and I marked anniversaries not with extravagance but reflection, revisiting vows and boundaries and intentions, celebrating resilience as much as romance. Love became something active and deliberate rather than assumed. Each year reaffirmed the choice we made to prioritize health over habitat. Occasionally received messages from people who knew fragments of our story asking how things turned out. I answered honestly that it was not easy, but it was worth it. That boundaries saved us not because they excluded love but because they defined it. Clarity replaced chaos and effort replaced hope. As the foundation looking ahead, we planned thoughtfully, discussing children and relocation and career shifts with the same intentionality that guided earlier decisions. Linda would have a role defined by respect rather than expectation. That understanding prevented future conflict before it began. The greatest transformation was internal. Fear no longer dictated my choices, and Ethan no longer outsourced his peace to others' approval. Together we built a partnership rooted in mutual responsibility. The past remained part of our story but not its author. In quiet moments, I reflected on the irony that the attempt to remove me from Ethan's life ultimately forced him to confront the patterns that held him back. Loss became the catalyst for growth and pain, the teacher of clarity. What nearly destroyed us revealed what we needed to survive. Our life was not perfect and never aimed to be. It was honest and grounded and resilient, shaped by lessons learned the hard way and choices upheld consistently. Love endured not because it was easy but because it was protected. As time continued its steady march, I felt gratitude replace resentment, understanding that hardship refined rather than ruined us. The future stretched ahead, not as a promise of simplicity but as an invitation to continue choosing each other with eyes open and hearts steady. And that was the quiet victory. Not a dramatic ending but a sustainable beginning, built on respect and effort and the courage to say no when necessary. Together, Ethan and I created the life we once imagined and then reshaped into something stronger and more real.